Hello, my name is Thomas Baines. I'm here to present a small portfolio of 3 prototypes I created alongside my peers over a few-week period. Across these weeks, the aim was to develop key industry skills, particularly those shown being asset development, both within 2D and 3D, UI design, level design, and VFX production. Above all else though, teamwork was a highlighted priority for us to advance. I'll proceed to show 3 separate samples, discuss the themes shown, our team's inspiration, and my role in production. Week 2. Red Devil. First up, our Week 2 prototyping theme we was given was red, and with such a broad subject matter at our fingertips, the team sought not only just to include the colour red as much as possible within the game, but also explore the colour theory of what red could bring to a game. Research found that red invokes the feelings of anger, panic, warning and death, and therefore we wanted to invoke these feelings onto the player via the gameplay and audio and visual design. We settled on an endless runner approach to the gameplay, with falling platforms to keep the adrenaline high in the player, as well as a hellish nightmare as our environment, which would allow us to use the colour in abundance. Some key inspirations for the team were the Doom franchise, and personally for myself, the Hellfire chapters seen in Kentaro Miura's Berserk manga, and particularly Stage 3 of Sega's Altered Beast game for the Sega Mega Drive. These inspirations should be clearly reflected in the assets I was chosen to create for the project, as I was in charge of the terrain, backgrounds, and some obstacles. Since the terrain that we were using was to be procedurally generated, I had to ensure that the terrain was functionally modular, so it could be swapped out continuously to keep emergent intact by avoiding repetitivity within the floor tiles. As I also stated, I was tasked by creating obstacles for the player. Shorter, easier obstacles used contrasting, lighter colours like greens and greys, which are visually apparent to the player, whilst taller obstacles used less vibrant colours like blacks and browns, which blend closer into the environment. This keeps the player retention intact by losing focus and letting these obstacles blend into the background. They would receive harsher punishment for their poor reaction times. I believe my theming was appropriate, with demonic symbols such as gravestones and pentagrams and pitchforks, while also attempting to appeal better to our target audience, that being of older teenagers and young adults. Using mild body horror akin to the inspirations such as eyes, bones, and organic-looking bridges in the environment. Here you can see a parallax scrolling attempt used for the background theming, similar to that used in the 16-bit era. You may also notice the lack of my obstacles, as when implementing these into our Unity build, we found problems with the collision that we were unable to fix within the time frame, so these had to be left on the cutting room floor, as it was too late into development for a fix, and Unity was the best suited for 2D gameplay. All my assets were created in Photoshop on a limited colour palette akin to the times, which allowed me to explore colouring techniques I hadn't done previously. In future, I think I'd like to experiment with realistic lighting in my pixel art, as some of the red lighting in the surroundings were not visually apparent on some of my assets, which led them to stick out. Pixel scaling was another key priority for me in future, as there are multiple resolutions used, which wouldn't have been accurate to the graphical limitations of the time period. Week 3. Mouse Quest 3. Now the theme for Week 3 was Solve It, and with the obvious approach of making a simple puzzle game, we actually decided a different route, that being a multiplayer puzzle game. We wanted to create an experience akin to the likes of popular VR game Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes. This meant we had to have 2 playable options. First, a navigator, which was given a list of instructions and directions that would aid player 1, who would need to use the communications of player 2 to navigate a maze, using key points of interest that would aid the communication between both sides. Due to this, we decided the theming of the game should be that of a lab rat, lost in a maze. And then, this inspired the title, Mouse Quest 3, named for no particular reason. Upon that point, the game's theming was originally supposed to be quite light-hearted and tongue-in-cheek, much like the title. This was realised with my vision of light happy visuals, as well as a squeak button, which is there purely for comedic purposes. Now, my primary role on the project was to build the user interface, particularly that of the main menu. And frankly, this was a project I struggled with. Since the project was to be made in Unreal, I was set to use Unreal's menu editors, something I had very little experience in. However, I began work on creating some assets, such as the title and the buttons, which were inspired by cheese for the obvious aesthetic of a mouse quest. One challenge I faced while creating the menu was anchoring my buttons, as when I went into a full-screen playable demo, they would not appear in any functional form. However, I managed to fix this by assigning my buttons to a vertical box. I also experimented with some other features, such as buttons which are highlighted when the mouse goes over them, and a fade-out animation when starting the game. Other aspects included a Player 2 instruction menu and a quit function. Whilst rudimentary, I believe the menu serves its purpose, yet still leaves a lot to be desired. Some areas of improvement, I believe, would to establish a consistent theme and art style, as the tonal clash when entering the gameplay is abundantly apparent. I think a few more meetings before actually going ahead into development on the style of the game would have been greatly beneficial for this project. A couple of the objects were also used, such as the cheese features on the title screen, were used to create extra time for the player as equipable pickups. Furthermore, I saw other students implement options and settings such as aspect ratios and resolutions. I really would like to try and implement this into my own games in the future. Week 6, Horror Pac-Man. Finally, as we came to week 6, we was given the theme of classic games gone wrong, and from the get-go our team knew exactly what we wanted to do. We wanted to subvert the expectations on a tonal and playable level, which gave us the idea of a horror-themed recreation of Pac-Man. Whilst the ground had been covered before, my team and I thought we could produce a new spin on the concept by pushing horror games of the 32-bit era, such as Resident Evil 2, and modern horror standards, such as sound design and jump scares, keeping intact the retro aesthetic of the classic title, while shifting dimension and creating a moodier and much tonally different experience. I was tasked by creating the level design. My aim was to create an atmospheric yet faithful recreation of the Pac-Man maze from the original arcade game. I began work in Maya. Taking what I'd learned from week 2, I created a modular wall system that I could easily snap into Unreal. Therefore, scaling was a must when creating these, so they were all made in a uniform size based on the original wall I created, and then edited, creating curves, pillars, edges and T-shapes. These were then textured in Maya's Hypershade, using textures by looking for inspiration from Bing's generative image AI. This is an upcoming, albeit controversial tool in the industry, however really helped when creating the textures. Furthermore, once I created the original texture, I then restored an older version of Adobe Photoshop to easily create an ambient occlusion, displacement, normal and specular maps. This feature in the 3D mode had been removed in later iterations. I then began a recreation of the original maze patterns. I utilised older style Unreal skyboxes due to the aesthetic stars and was able to create a nice blue hue over the whole scene. I then began to experiment with particle effects, such as global dust particles, as well as isolated spark effects, which I attached to the end of neon rods which lined the walls of the maze. I created these using a really helpful tutorial from the internet. I think it really adds for the retro use futuristic aesthetic our team was looking for. Finally, I placed a global thick fog of war over the map to obscure the player's vision. I believe this will enhance dread and unease, as well as emulate how the fog was used to hide a lack of graphical power in older games such as Silent Hill. Overall, I'm quite pleased with what I put out on this project. I believe it was really implemented well and enhances the variable audio my teammates added to the monster Pac-Man. I think in future, if I used a post-processing filter to really match the pixel aesthetic of the early 32-bit games, I would enhance the work that we created nicely.